At the end of the day, the goal of an education is to enable your child to live a good life.
Welcome back to the OpenEd podcast. I'm Isaac Morehouse, the sometimes host. Sometimes we have other hosts. Today, I am joined by Hannah Frankman, who is, she runs Rebel Educator. And Hannah, I have known for quite a while because Hannah came as a homeschooler who was just getting ready to graduate and came and worked for me at Praxis and was an amazing employee, went on to do great things there, and is now a very prominent voice in the education space. So Hannah, welcome. Glad to have you.
It's exciting to be here, Isaac.
First, I got to just ask you, I know how passionate you are about alternatives to education and your own homeschool experience, your experience with Praxis, which is a college alternative. But when and how decide I got to be loud about this. I got to be a voice about this and get Rebel Educator off the ground. Sort of what's the goal of Rebel Educator and how did that come about?
I launched Rebel Educator a little over 2 years ago, but I've been talking about alternative education long before that, and working at Praxis is actually where I got my start in, quote, education commentary, because I was writing blog posts for the marketing team, partly about my experience being homeschooled and then not going to college and starting to work in startups instead. And that's when I started to realize that this was a thing I really liked talking about, and that it was really important to talk about, that there were not nearly enough resources out there for parents. So Rebel Educator was sort of the culmination of a few years of writing very independently about education and slowly formulating this hypothesis that if you really care about the future, the education of our children is one of the most important things to get right.
I mean, you've got in that 2 years, you have 140,000 followers on Twitter, and that's for good reason because you're putting out really, really great stuff. You have some very fun, kind of edgy, but very useful threads and tweets out there. And I wanted to use a couple of those as jumping off points for topics. I kind of want to get into 3 topics today: deschooling, what that's all about, and then critical thinking and time use or pacing, because you've had some really good threads on all 3 of those. So I want to start with deschooling. There's unschooling has become sort of a popular thing that people have heard of, which is essentially kind of like letting your kids have maximum freedom to learn how they want and sort of do what they want and play and not prescribing a lot for them. Deschooling is something different that we used to talk about a lot at Praxis. It's kind of the process of unlearning all the bad habits, primarily that you picked up in school. But even those of us who grew up homeschooled, we are in such a schooled society that a lot of the assumptions and mindsets and beliefs about learning and learning processes and things are just so pervasive throughout society that even if you weren't in school, you have less deschooling needed. I used to say this when people would join the Praxis program. If they were homeschooled, we didn't need to take as long to have them unlearn a lot of things. They only needed to unlearn a few things. If they had spent their life in the public school system or even the private school system, there was more deschooling that needed to be done before we could start to really teach them how to be successful in their career. So you walk through a lot of these things that you think people need to unlearn. Dive into this for me. Walk me through some of these and how you've seen those play out, either in your own life or just with all the people that you're interacting with, hundreds and thousands of young people. Talk to me about deschooling and what the need is there and what are those main things that people need to unlearn.
I think you hit on a really important point in teeing up this question, which is that we live in a very schooled society. There's this great little book by Ivan Illich called Deschooling Society that everyone should read. The schooled mindset is a very cultural phenomenon. So I was homeschooled 1st grade through 12th grade, barely set foot inside of any normal education institution for my entire childhood. And I still had all kinds of mindsets that I'd picked up from the culture that I had to unlearn. I remember when I was a junior in high school, I took the PSAT because I thought maybe I was going to go to college, and I checked that little box at the bottom of the test that said, yes, you colleges can send me mailings. And I got boxes of pamphlets from colleges, and they were all talking about how are you going to change the world, and the language that they used had a very big impact on my 16-year-old brain as I was thinking about my career that I had to unlearn afterwards. It's like, okay, doing well in college does not equate to being successful in the real world, but I somehow picked up that I needed an equivalent to doing well in college in order to be okay. Um, so even if a child is not immersed in the normal education system, they're still going to pick this stuff up. So there's a really great book by John Taylor Gatto called Dumbing Us Down. And for those who are not yet familiar, have not yet had the pleasure of reading Gatto's amazing books, he was a public school teacher in New York City for 30 years, worked in every type of school imaginable. And he won Teacher of the Year 2 years in a row. And the second time he won, he accepted his nomination and resigned from his position all in the same time in the pages of the New York Times. And he wrote this really amazing piece about why he felt like he was doing more harm than good as a school teacher. And if he really wanted to help the youth, he had to find something else to do. And he talks about this idea of sort of the secondary lessons or the underpinning lessons that you're learning when you're in school. So we think we send our kids to school and they're learning math and reading and writing, and they're learning about the history of our country and the history of the world, and they're learning how to solve geometrical equations. And they are learning all of those things, but there are a set of implicit lessons baked into how school is structured, that you have to appease authority and please authority in order to be considered successful, that you have to do things in the correct order and pass the test in order to have learned something well, that the measure of your success isn't, it has nothing to do with what you can do in the real world. It has everything to do with how you're able to score on some standardized measure of your learning. There are all of these implicit lessons that kids are learning, and most of us go through our entire lives without ever unlearning these things. And so they're baked into how we engage with the adult world. We look for tests to pass, and we look for the authority figure that we have to appease or please in order to get the thing that we want. If we decide we want to make $100,000 a year, our mindset is, okay, we have to go find somebody who's happy enough with us that they will give us permission to make $100,000 a year. They'll sign their name on the dotted line and give us the checks. And that's how you're successful. And people who have shed some of this mindset or never picked it up in the first place, and a lot of this is just because of personality and kind of nature, less nurture, will be very entrepreneurial, and they'll see things very differently. And they'll say, I want to make $100,000 this year. I wonder what I can do to make that money happen. Maybe I can launch a drop shipping business. Maybe I can sell an online course. Maybe there's a need in my local market to, I don't know, build a coffee shop or a car wash business or something that will have high margins and allow me to make $100,000. And those people are in some ways deschooled. Sometimes not intentionally, but they haven't adopted some of these permission-based mindsets.
So sometimes the schooling doesn't stick.
Yes.
And often those are people that have an easier time in the market transitioning into, roles where there isn't as much of a playbook. If you're not going to go into academia or government, most of those things don't translate very well. Those implicit things. I think that's such a great point that you brought out. There's two different types of learning that are happening at all times in every situation. There's the explicit stuff. When you're sitting listening to a lecture, the content of what they're telling you, that's sort of the explicit stuff, whatever it's about, history, English, whatever. But implicitly, in every environment, you are learning through conditioning what is rewarded, what is praised, what is punished, what has a cost associated with it, what has a benefit associated with it. And so just being aware that that is going on is, I think, such a huge thing to step back for yourself and for your kids and say, okay, it's easy to find the explicit things that are being taught and possibly learned, with varying degrees of success. What are the implicit lessons that I grew up with? What things was I conditioned to? What was I rewarded for socially, financially, with attention, and what things was I not rewarded for and steered away from? And then you start to ask that question for your kids, and and learning becomes so much more than about the content. It becomes about the environment and the process as well. So there are environments where you might like what's being taught, but if the child is also being conditioned that one person knows everything and that the only way to succeed is to please that one person with a binary correct or incorrect, answer, like you don't want, those are mindsets that we all will have some of that to some degree in different settings, but those are mindsets you're going to have to unlearn. Those are going to make it harder for you to succeed in the market where nobody really knows and you're trying to figure out how to create value for people by being a creative problem solver. So I just think that difference between implicit and explicit learning is so important.
Yeah, and there's a lot of this stuff that people pick up. There's a passivity that's implicitly baked into how most schooling institutions approach education. You're not supposed to go seek out information. You're supposed to sit down and be quiet at the designated time, and someone will hand you the information one piece at a time. There's a sort of lack of agency in your own education process, and you're punished for having too much agency. If you ask too many questions, you're disruptive. If you skip ahead because you're curious about something and you're following your curiosity, you're just being distracting to the rest of the class. And so we learn this passivity that the next thing will be handed to us and we just have to wait. We learn to wait for permission. We have to raise our hands and ask to do anything. If somebody gives us an assignment and we have an idea to do it better, we have to get permission to do that in order to have our work still qualify for being graded and getting credit. Whereas in the real world, if someone gives you an assignment and you go, I actually have a better idea, you can just go build something and nobody's stopping you. But most people don't even think about other possibilities because they spent all of their formative years inside of a system that only rewarded asking for permission and doing what you're told. You're taught to learn to the test, which I think is one of maybe the most horrible of these things from a raw just building knowledge standpoint. When you spend your entire childhood operating under the assumption that if you want to be knowledgeable and successful, you have to predict what's going to be on a quarterly or end of year test, and then you have to tailor all of your learning around memorizing the things that are going to be on the test. You spend the rest of your life looking for the metrics of what you're supposed to know, as opposed to following your curiosity and allowing it to build a very robust body of knowledge that you can carry with you. If you work in any type of field that's even remotely creative, you know that part of your edge is being able to come up with ideas that other people haven't come up with yet. And part of how you do that is by having a source, a well of knowledge that's different from other people who are tackling the same problem. The more dynamic and unusual your knowledge is, the better served you are, and the more able you are to think critically, and which I know we're going to get into in a little bit, and assess information and make your own determination about it. There's nothing in practicing for a test that teaches you that level of discernment, and yet you spend your whole life thinking that learning equates to memorizing the things that are going to be on a test, and that retention beyond taking the test isn't even important. You're not measured on that. Nobody comes back and tests you 3 years later and like, okay, do you still remember algebra? Nobody cares. And so you don't retain stuff. And so you learn that as long as you check the box, you've learned something, which is very counterproductive to building a lifelong body of knowledge. But there's all sorts of things like this that school teaches us. And we spend so much time inside of that system that by the time we graduate, it's the only way we've known the world to work. And so we just assume that this is how we should keep going for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, and this is very much obviously in our name and in a kind of our mission, the opening up so that you see all options, all resources, all approaches as tools in a toolkit. And I think that applies to life in general more broadly. What I find happens a lot with people that I've hired over the years, if they haven't yet kind of deschooled themselves a little bit, if you present them with a goal, okay, here's an outcome I'd like you to produce. Their next question is, okay, what's the process? How do I do it? Like, give me the step by step. And my response is like, I don't know. That's what your job is, to figure out how to get there. And I think having a goal, instead of like, okay, you have to, for an assignment, write a paper. It has to be this many pages about this book and do this and this and this. That's very prescriptive, and like you're trying to follow each step along the way. The steps are all given to you. And the goal is one that's kind of not a real goal, right? It's like, hey, I'm just giving you this arbitrary thing. You just follow these steps and then I'll call it good. Versus something like, hey, how many subscribers can we get on our newsletter? Or how much revenue can we get selling this new product? Let's make a goal and you go figure out how to do it. The key is, it's not that everyone has to make up from scratch what stands from between you and that goal. It's that all of the resources out there, all the ideas and approaches and things other people have done in the past, those should all be tools in the toolkit. Like you're going to go ask a bunch of other people, maybe those that you feel like are similar to you or have achieved things you want to achieve. You're going to go look at what they've done. You're going to go do a little study here and there. You're going to take pieces from it, but you're going to adapt it to your own. You're going to decide which ones you want to throw out and which ones you don't think are work, where you want to break the rules and where you don't. A great example of this, a friend of mine said way back in college, he had a class, they had to build a website. And he's like, I got an A, and it was the ugliest, most useless website you've ever seen. But the teacher gave it an A because it met whatever the requirements were, the minimum requirements. And so like, that's what I was conditioned to do. Once I got out in the world and I realized I needed a website, or my company needed a website, none of that had any relevance, because suddenly it's not, well, do you check the boxes? Did you technically do everything right? It's, what is the website doing? What is the outcome it's producing? If people are confused by it, I don't care how much I like it or somebody else says it looks nice. There's not a teacher that says, good job, now you get to earn a profit, right? Like, you got to go win those customers. And he's like, suddenly I spent hours going and looking at all these resources and learning on my own about different approaches to designing websites. And I took little pieces from all of them, and then I made it, and I made it my own, and I change it and I adapt it all the time. And like, is it an A+ website? No, but it never will be A+. It's always, there's no such thing in the real world. It's like, it's doing the job better than it used to, and I'm always trying to make it better. And like, that's such a hard shift for a lot of people to get to. So anyway, I think that deschooling process is something that all of us have to deliberately think about when we find ourselves, whenever you find yourself feeling like a victim, that's a good indicator that you got a little bit of the deschooling left to do.
Mm-hmm. And everybody needs it. Like, if you pull your kid out of public school, I tell parents this frequently, you should give them a period of deschooling before you just put them in a new education program. Sometimes they're ready, but sometimes it's really helpful for them to just take a couple months and not do anything and unlearn and just kind of detox from the school environment. If you give your kid, there are schools that do this too. If they have a new student come in who's coming from public school, they just won't enforce them doing anything for a while, and they sort of let the culture of the school sort of peer pressure them over time into starting to do productive things in a self-directed manner. But if you pull your kid out of school, it can be really productive to just let them do whatever they want or absolutely nothing for days at a time and experience that boredom that forces them to start to question, if there's no one in front of me telling me what to do, what do I want to do? It's extremely healthy. I even think adults should do this sometimes when they're in between jobs or in between projects. It's really helpful to take a little bit of time and not have something that you have to do, because it's easy to get into a school mindset inside of a job too, or if you went straight from from public education to college to the working world, you maybe never had a point to stop and ask these questions. But if you have a little bit of space to say, okay, no boss is telling me what to do, There's no clear-cut test to pass or metric of success that someone has put in front of me. What do I want to do in that space? Sometimes really amazing things start to emerge. People write books, people start companies, people design clothes or software or all kinds of cool things. But you need that space. And so if an adult never had a chance to be deschooled, it's just as important for an adult as it is for a child.
One of the things that is really hard is learning to create your own structure. If you have been used to having a schedule and structure always provided to you entirely, and you don't really have to think about how you're going to plan your day or what you're going to do, it's just kind of there. And I think a great way to ease kids into that is to just start with little chunks. Say, okay, maybe they have one particular goal. Say, for this goal, what do you want to do to get there? And maybe the first 2 hours of every day, that's your time to allot to that goal. And like maybe you should try to make a plan or create some kind of routines for yourself to get there. And like give them that space, but associated with a goal, and kind of let them little by little learn how to get there, because that can be really crippling for people if they suddenly they're out in the world, and if they're in a spot where they don't have a job yet and they're trying to figure out what they want to do and they don't have any externally imposed structure. I've seen a lot of young people really flounder if they've never learned the ability to create their own structure, to set goals, to build a schedule, to build habits and routines, to stick with them. If that's only ever been motivated by, the stick of somebody else saying you're going to be feeling pain if you don't do this, then they don't know how to connect it to their own goals and desires. So I think starting when you're young with that is huge.
It's kind of like when kids go to college and they've only ever been inside the public school system and they struggle in their freshman year because they've never had to manage their own schedule before. We see this phenomenon a lot. It happens. Even if you don't completely exit the system, you still run into this scheduling, self-direction problem when you move through different tiers of the education system and you suddenly have way more freedom than you had before, even if it's only freedom in a relative sense. It's hard.
Yeah, it's funny. I was homeschooled for most of the time, and then I went to a private school for my sophomore year, and I just remember it was so foreign to me having every minute of the day scheduled by someone else, and I couldn't just change that. I couldn't be like, Tuesdays I'd rather work and earn money, and then I'll double my work on Wednesday. Like that wasn't an option. And I was always used to being able to do that, and that was really, I almost had like the reverse culture shock. Like, whoa.
People
So
live like
okay,
this.
so deschooling, unlearning the bad habits and assumptions, very, very, very crucial. But then what are you going to put in there, right? Okay, you remove some of these things that might be holding you back and giving you, unneeded challenges. What are the kind of things that you do need to learn? Not specific things, but like foundation building blocks. You had a great thread about critical thinking or just learning how to think in general. And I think that gets overlooked a lot. It's kind of like, okay, what are the specific subjects people need to learn and the facts they need to learn, and competency levels at these various things. But I mean, people say this, how to think is more important than what to think. But what does that really mean? Like, what are the building blocks of critical thinking in your mind?
There are a few. This is a thing that can be broken down. The critical thinking is such a buzz term that gets thrown around the internet. Society would be so much better if everybody just learned to critically think. And it's true. If you subtract all of this authority following, permission seeking mental frameworks that people use to navigate the world, and you learn how to actually think about what you want out of life and what you want to accomplish and what's meaningful to you and what you value and what the steps are in the process to bring more of that value and more of that meaning into your life, that's really powerful. People aren't wrong, but most people don't actually break down what critical thinking means. And there are things that parents can teach there, because at the end of the day, it's the ability to look at the world and to analyze it and to make sense of it and to formulate opinions about it. Not opinions that have been handed to you, but opinions stemming from your own analysis of the information in front of you. And so there are a lot of different ways that a parent can teach those habits to their kids and model that to their kids. I'm a very big advocate of teaching kids philosophy, especially as they get older. This is a thing that's been very watered down in our public school curricula, but it's something that it's the building blocks of how our civilization has been structured. And so understanding it is sort of like having a cheat code. It's kind of like, you know how schools stopped teaching kids phonics and they started teaching kids how to read by just recognizing words, like the look say method. You're stripping kids of it's crazy that people do this because you're stripping kids of the cheat code that is the alphabet, which allows you to decode any word you could ever come across, not just in the English language, but in other languages too. You're not teaching kids the code anymore. You're just saying, look at a word and recognize it. If you don't recognize it for sure, guess what it is based on the clues of the rest of the sentence. And so there are these building blocks of understanding language that there's only 26 letters. It's not even that hard to teach kids. It's not that much information. We don't teach it to our children. And this was standard practice for teaching kids how to read in public schools for decades. We do the same thing with thought. We have these philosophical underpinnings of our culture, and we don't teach them to kids. Kids don't understand the history of philosophy. They don't understand the Western canon. They don't understand how both dynamic and also in some ways like singularly dimensioned the trajectory of how we think throughout history has unfolded. And if you teach your kids the basics, you expose them to some of the great works, you talk about philosophical ideas, they're going to learn very quickly that most of the philosophical opinions of their culture, where they came from and how they were formulated, so they can discern for themselves whether or not they even agree or what they think about them. You can teach your kids mental models that they can use to dissect some of this. There are a lot of mental models that circulate on Twitter quite a bit. Things like first principles, the 80-20 principle, second order thinking. There are all sorts of mental models that you can teach kids that sort of, again, it sort of pulls back the curtain to how your brain analyzes information. And instead of just memorizing things other people have told you, it allows you to take raw information sets and start to make sense of them yourself and decide what you think about something.
You've got in this thread, you have 5 different recommendations for critical thinking. So one is mental models, as you mentioned, and you list several. One is basic economics, which I'm a huge fan of.
Everybody should understand economics.
Yeah, just supply and demand alone. If you just sort of understand supply and demand and where prices come from and understand unintended effects, trade-offs, opportunity cost. Oh my gosh, it's just so helpful, especially in not letting yourself feel like a victim. If you have that economic thinking, it can help a lot understanding those instead of just feeling like, oh, this is unfair. Why does this cost so much? Being able to at least think of the logic. Philosophy, which you mentioned, how to formulate arguments. I love this one. I want to put a pin in that and come back in a second. A, therefore B, if not A, not B, very basic logic. And then philosophical razors, Occam's razor, which most people are familiar with, but you list a couple others in here. Hanlon's razor, Hitchens' razor, the duck test. I haven't heard of those last 3. What are those?
So basically a razor, I have a whole thread on just razors. Let me see if I can find it really quickly because I had a whole bunch more than just this. So this might actually be a good thing to link somewhere.
While you're looking for that, I will mention so when you said formulate arguments, I had a handful of classes in community college that I found really valuable. Maybe one at 4-year university that I found valuable. But one of them was a logic course and going through and turning arguments into symbols, like turning statements into letters, for example. And the argument, essentially looks like a math equation, categorical syllogisms and things like this. At first I was like, why are we doing this? But then it really actually got really fun. And then once you learn sort of like various logical fallacies, I think those are really, really great to learn. A lot of people are familiar with things like ad hominem or appeal to authority, but understanding that and being able to then go and like watch the news or something or get on social media and just scroll through what people say and see if you can break down the claims that they're making and see how many of them are logical, right? And like see how many fallacies are being committed. That's actually really fun for a kid in their teens, especially if they're cynical at all. You can actually lean into that cynicism and be like, hey, let's learn basic logic and let's learn logical fallacies and let's go spot how many people are not making any sense.
That's really good. I found the thread. I
Okay,
just
yeah.
dropped
So
it in the
so
chat
clue
here
me
so
in
you
on a
can
couple of these
hear it.
razors.
So my favorite is the duck test because everybody's familiar with the expression it comes from. If it looks like a duck, if it swims like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, then it's probably a duck.
Yep.
Basically, it's just like if you are observing the habits of something, you can identify it. And it's sort of a reminder to not overcomplicate things. We have a tendency to look at a piece of information and come up with very complicated hypotheses around what it might be and how it might have gotten there. It's sort of similar to Occam's razor, but it's more about identifying things as opposed to coming up with an answer. If it looks like a duck, it's probably just a duck. Hanlon's razor is a philosophical rule of thumb that you use to kind of eliminate unlikely explanations. Never attribute to malice that which can be adequately explained by stupidity.
Yes. Okay. I'm familiar with this one. Yeah, very much so.
But there's a few here in this thread. Occam's razor, obviously everybody's familiar with. The simplest explanation is most likely to be the correct one. Hitchens' razor, if something is asserted without evidence, it can be dismissed without evidence, which is a really useful one to bear in mind when you're arguing with somebody and they just make this outlandish claim and you're like, well, maybe we don't include that in our argument because you can't prove it.
What I love about razors is they're very pragmatic. So they have a similar, like, these are tools in your toolkit. They are not always and everywhere universal. So like sometimes the simplest explanation isn't actually correct. But if you start with your default assumption that it probably is, or if it looks like it, whatever the most obvious thing is probably true, that helps you get better at identifying those exceptions. And like, I'm just so pragmatic when it comes to this stuff. This is why I like mental models, that being able to use them as tools and to recognize I'm going to start here. These are like starting points when you're going out and trying to recognize patterns in the world. And I think similarly, again, it takes some deschooling to even find these valuable, because you want to be like, okay, so always and everywhere, the simple thing is always the true thing. Great, got it. And it's like, no, that's not the case. Yeah. Most of the time, like, this is a heuristic. These are rules of thumb. They're not always, but they're tools. And I think approaching education in this way as well, like, hey, most of the time kids will learn better under these conditions, but my kid under these conditions is not learning well. So maybe I need to make a change. And if you look around and nobody else seems to be agreeing with you, that doesn't mean you're wrong, right? Like, I think it's so valuable to have rules of thumb that can help your thinking rather than, I mean, there are some things that are true, that are objectively true, and some universals, but they're very few. And when we're trying to navigate the world, it's more useful to have tools than it is to have, black and white lines that sort of prescribe what's true, and then it blinds us to being able to see things that are deeper. Anyway,
well, also,
that was a little rambly there, but
you know how we determined that those things are universally and indivisibly true is we spent a lot of time observing them and using things like mental models to observe the behaviors of these various phenomenon and finding that we couldn't find exceptions to these rules, therefore they seem to be indivisibly true.
Yeah.
But it required this type of thinking in order to discern that these things
that's it. That's a good point. Like, you have mental models, whether you think you do or not. So it's better to think about what they are. What are those assumptions that you have baked in, and make sure that they're good ones.
Yeah. Can I share a couple more of my
Yeah,
favorite
yeah. Go
models?
through. Give
There's
me
a
a couple
couple more
more.
that are really funny. There's one called Hume's guillotine, which is such a great name for a mental model. You should teach that one to your sons because they're gonna love it. Um, and it states that a cause must be sufficiently able to produce the effect assigned to them, which is a good measure of like, okay, if we're saying that this thing happened, like X happened because of Y, is Y actually powerful enough to cause X? Or actually capable enough to cause X? Which is a really helpful, it's not always the most intuitive question to ask, but it's very helpful, especially if you're teaching your kids to be independent thinkers in the age of the internet. All of these are incredibly important because things circulate on the internet all the time that don't make sense or aren't well verified, and maybe they look really prestigious. So you just assume that whoever published the thing knows what they're talking about, but having these razors to verify information is incredibly
I wonder if
important.
there's one for kind of a variation on Hume's guillotine there, which is there are sometimes things that could be a sufficient explanation, but we'll put it this way: if X caused Y in this instance, why would X not always cause Y in other instances? What I'm thinking of is whenever something happens, like there's a malfunction in a product, like a car has a part that was bad and it causes the car to explode. What do you always hear? People will say, "Oh, it's because of greed. The car company was greedy, so they cut corners, and therefore it happened." And it's like, okay, well, greed exists always and everywhere. Everybody's almost always greedy all the time. So why did this only happen this time? Why hasn't it happened all? Why doesn't every part break on every car all the time? So like, if that is an explanation for this, which it could be, I'm not ruling it out, but then you have to answer the question, why only this? Why did greed only cause a problem this one time? And this is actually rare that this happens. Anyway, I don't know if there's a specific razor for that, but that one always bugs me. That always bugs me. It's like, yes, it is possible that caused it, but then you have to answer, why doesn't it cause it constantly? Why isn't it everywhere all the time? Do you have any other razors you wanted to share?
There's one more that's really funny, just the name. It's called Adler's razor, but it has another name, which is Newton's flaming laser sword, which is also a good one to teach your kids because, again, the name is really funny. And it's just that if something can't be settled by experimentation and reason, it's not worth debating. Like if you can't produce sufficient evidence or sufficient rationale arguments to make and debate your point, then it's not worth the other person's time. I just think it has a great name, and I like throwing the ones with great names out there because they can be very enticing for kids
Well,
to
I
learn these
love
things.
that
They're just
too.
fun.
The reminder, okay, so if you can settle it with experimentation or logic, then sure, maybe it's worth debating. Maybe doesn't mean it is, but maybe. If you can't, it's not worth debating. And I think that's so important. It's like it doesn't mean it's not worth anything. There are things I cannot experimentally verify or prove to you with logic. How much I love my wife, for example. That doesn't mean that is unimportant or untrue. It means that it's not worth me getting in a fight with you about what that level of love is that I have for my, like, why there's no, it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to be settled. I think that one is actually really important these days, where everything you feel like you have to fight and have debates. Certain things may actually have the ability to uncover through logic or experimentation a conclusion. Now, whether or not it still may not be productive to debate it, but some things can't. So don't worry about it.
It's
Don't waste your
also
time. I love
such an
that.
important reminder of the burden of proof being on the person who's picking the fight. Like if you, because again, this is something that if you spend your entire life in a classroom being told that if somebody tells you something is true and you have to listen and memorize it, it can sort of desensitize you to
Yes.
questioning
You,
things that
you
other
think
people
as
are
the
saying.
student, you think the burden of proof is on you. If the teacher says something is true and you disagree, she's made a claim, or he, and you feel that in that setting, the burden of proof is on you to show why anyone should be skeptical of that. When actuality, the person making the claim, the burden of proof should be on them. But we get conditioned into that, right? So if someone in a perceived position of authority makes a claim, we immediately feel like, well, that's the default. That must be true unless there's really compelling evidence otherwise. And there's no reason that should be the case. So
Exactly.
okay, we got a few more minutes here, which is a great connection, great segue into a topic of usage of time and wasting time, not wasting time.
Always correctly spent talking about Smedley, Butler, and razors.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. See, that's what when you get to follow your interests wherever they lead you, even in the course of a podcast conversation, that's a good thing. So this is something that my friend Jeff Till years ago just told me this, and I had never run the math in my head that the average kid spends 15,000 hours in school.
Yep.
15,000 hours. When you think of it that way, like that's a lot. So what are those hours being used for? And I remember reading a bunch of studies. I think it was by John Holt, who's an education researcher. It's pretty big in the 80s and 90s, on how long it takes kids to learn various things. And the key was this concept of focused instruction. When it came to like the big three, reading, writing, and arithmetic, kids could learn with like it was something like, don't quote me on the specifics, but it was something insane like math, for example, 20 hours of focused learning, they could go from basically 0 to algebra. And, reading, very similar. And the amount of hours of unfocused learning that's happening in school for each of those topics is hundreds or 1,000 plus sometimes. And so just this idea that learning, when the motivation is there, can be so quick. You can go from 0 to 100 really fast when you're motivated, when you have a reason to learn it. When you don't, and it's just being imposed upon you, it's not sticking. So much of the time, the instructional time is really being wasted because you're not in a good position to actually learn it. You don't know why you should be learning it. It's of no interest to you. And it takes so many more hours. It's so inefficient. So anyway, you got me rolling on this, but I'd love for you to dive into, your thoughts on time in learning. That, we kind of have this idea, my kid needs to study a subject for X number of hours a day for X number of years, because we all assume the school thing, and we all feel kind of like scared or embarrassed if our kid is not spending that much time on that subject. What do you think about learning and timing and pacing in learning?
Every homeschooler knows that you can learn everything that you need to learn in 2 hours a day of studying. Most of the time that is spent in school is not productive time. It's incredibly unfocused because you're shuffling between subjects. And if you're in grades 7 through 12 and you're moving between teachers and classrooms throughout the day, you're spending maybe 45 minutes to an hour in a class, which is just enough time to get settled in and get focused. If a kid is spending 45 minutes to an hour in a classroom, they have almost no time to do actual focused work. So much time spent inside of a class is wasted space. You're taking attendance, you're chatting with your teacher, you're catching up on assignments, you're going through logistics. The amount of time actually spent doing focused learning is very small. And as soon as you have focus, you're breaking it again to move on to the next thing. You're also working at the pace, like sort of the averaged pace of an entire class instead of the individual pace at which you learn, which is almost universally not the optimal pace. It's not the right pace for any kid. It's sort of this weird amalgamed average, this sort of invisible student that doesn't actually exist.
Yes.
And so you're wasting most of your time. And we could go deep down the rabbit hole in terms of the actual learning science that's behind all of this and how kids learn best and how the way that they're learning in school is almost completely at odds with that, which is part of what causes kids to not be learning effectively with their, like, using their time effectively and therefore wasting most of it. But when you separate the child from the classroom and you say, okay, this is what you're supposed to learn this year. This is the math curriculum you're working through. This is the reading curriculum you're going to work through. This is your reading list. These are your writing assignments. Even if you're giving them a top-down curriculum, and you're still moving them through a relatively normal trajectory of materials. A child who's allowed to move through that at their own pace usually will move through it very quickly, because when you take out all the fluff of walking through halls and listening to bells and chatting with your teacher and catching up on assignments, the actual work part doesn't take that much time. And when you can just focus and do it, you can knock it out super fast. And there are studies that are being done on this around how quickly kids actually can learn. It also plays with incentives. So there are studies that are being done around paying kids to learn. There were some really controversial studies done in the early 2000s by a guy named Roland Fryer, who's been controversial at every turn. He was a tenured professor at Harvard who got into a lot of trouble for studying all sorts of politically incorrect things. But one of his first forays into this was paying kids cash to study and observing how much their test scores improved and how rapidly they improved. And it turns out that if you're incentivizing kids with cash, they're going to focus and learn very quickly. It's like if you give them a reason to learn something, they suddenly are very good at doing that. Who would have thought? But if you're paying kids to learn, if you're playing with different incentive structures, kids can learn 5+ times as fast as they can in the normal classroom. It is not uncommon at all for kids to move through like 2-3 grade levels over the course of a year in a given subject when they are incentivized properly and allowed to move at their own pace.
And it should be mentioned too for parents out there who are like, okay, so if I just like give my kids some space, they'll go learn everything really fast, and then if they don't, something must be wrong with them. That's the point. Is it allows you the things that they are able to learn really fast when they're motivated, when there's a good reason, when they've got some of that space. It allows you more time for things that they may struggle with. Like some kids can blaze through certain things and let them go at their own pace on those things. And they may need a lot of work and a lot of time on other things. But it's surprising how much the motivation plays a factor. My oldest son, he's just not a math guy. He's not very good at math. He doesn't really like it. He's just kind of like, he's very analytical, very philosophical, very artistic. And so he was just way behind in math. And we were, we at various points, we tried kind of like getting him to do it and being really structured and fighting with him. But for the most part, we kind of threw up our hands for several years. Well, then all of a sudden he wanted to go to school. It was like a 2-day-a-week school when he was, I think, 13 or 14. So over the summer, we said, well, to go there, they make you take math. And if you want to be in math with other kids your age, some of your friends, you got to know the level of math that they're doing. And he's like, oh. So literally, he's like, well, I'll just start at the beginning. So that summer, he literally started Khan Academy as like a 13-year-old, 12-year-old. I think he was 13. He was like, I'll just start at kindergarten. And he just went through the entire Khan Academy until he caught up to like algebra or whatever they were at. And he caught it, and he did it in like a month or two, just by himself. And it's not like he's a master of math. He never will be. He doesn't care to be. But he was able to get to a level where he could get by, do okay, not feel embarrassed when he had that moment where he needed to. I also just want to say the learning speeds, different learning environments too, like learning from your peers or people only slightly older than you versus people way older than you is so interesting. And anyone with kids can observe this if you have multiple kids. Your older siblings' ability to teach their younger siblings things is so much better than you oftentimes. And like the things stick, especially if they look up to them. So my youngest son is 7 and my oldest is 19. And it's hilarious. Every once in a while, I'll walk in and my oldest son will be like just telling my youngest son about Greek myths or something like that. Or like extinct animals, something that they both find interesting. And they'll be talking for like 20 minutes. That 20-minute conversation, every single thing my older son said sticks in my younger son's memory. He knows it all. He can tell you, he can spit it back to you. He can tell you the names of all these dinosaurs. He can tell you, it's like total retention. When I try to teach him something, he doesn't remember any of it, but there's something magical there. So anyway, I think one of the main takeaways on the timing thing for parents, and I found this myself, is it's like if your kids have a good amount of time where they're kind of playing and doing things that don't appear like typical classroom learning, that's okay. Like that's okay. And even if you feel like they get behind and they need to catch up in something, catching up is actually a lot easier than you think it is and can happen a lot quicker than you think. I had this analogy while you were talking, and this is maybe a really dumb analogy, but it just it came to me about one of the reasons the classroom learning is so inefficient, being that you're trying to teach, 30 kids at once. Like imagine if you were trying to cut 30 kids' hair at once and you had one person and they had like a little machine that like hooked up scissors dangling above everyone's head, and just one person operates it. And so the scissors are making the exact same motion for every single head at the same time. And all 30 of those kids are in there trying to get their haircut. How long do you think it would take, and how good would that haircut be? Like, you would get 30 kids, none of whom were happy with their haircut, because you're trying to do all the cutting motions and the clippers and whatever in a way that's like generally applicable to the greatest number of people possible, which means everyone's going to get a bad haircut. You know what I mean? And now imagine that's just hair. How different and how unique every kid's mind is. And so the process of trying to do that, and there is a place for classroom learning. There's a place where lots of kids are together. There's a place for lectures, but trying to learn every subject all the time in that uniform way, there's no wonder it's inefficient. Even if it can work, it's inefficient most of the time, and it can happen a lot faster with some more freedom.
That's a really good analogy. And it's spot on with exactly what is happening inside of classrooms. I also want to just like asterisk that it's very easy to glorify speed and make it seem very impressive and aspirational that, well, my child learned like 8 grades of math in a month over the summer on Khan Academy. That is very impressive. I'm not calling you out as an example.
No.
But people hear that kind of story and they think, okay, my kid will have made it when they all of a sudden something clicks and they're able to learn multiple grade levels over the course of 1 year. And that's not the point here. And I want to be very clear about that. Your child shouldn't be aspiring to learn way faster than kids in the classroom if it doesn't align with their goals, if there's no reason why they're intrinsically motivated to do so, or for whatever reason they're not ready yet. The goal isn't to crack the code somehow so they suddenly can learn way faster. The point is that it is possible, and it routinely happens when a child is motivated correctly and incentivized for the right reasons to do something. It's possible for kids to learn this way. It happens. It should be enabled. It should be allowed. Kids should be given the space and the flexibility to a point that when they want to learn something quickly, they can. But it shouldn't be the thing that you're trying to push your kid into doing. There's nothing inherently virtuous about learning 2 grades of math in a year as opposed to 1. Yes. It doesn't make your child better. It doesn't even mean that it's a thing that's moving them towards whatever goals they have. At the end of the day, the goal of an education is to enable your child to live a good life. And part of that means having their own internal agency and compass to determine what they want and why and for what reasons, and to chase what they want for the right reasons. And part of it is to have, like, part of the ingredients of this is to have a level of self-direction and self-discipline. But when they have the freedom to learn things very fast and also not to learn things very fast, if that's what's aligned with their goals, that's the thing that indicates that you're on the right path. Not that if your child is learning faster than average, you're still playing the school game, which is, here are the metrics. My kid is scoring higher than yours.
If they need
you're
to go
still
slower,
thinking in a schooled mindset. That's you still haven't cracked it. That's really important.
If it takes a kid 4 hours to get through what it takes another kid an hour to get through, and they need that time, that's okay. If your kid is 10 and they're doing math at a typical 8-year-old level, like, that's okay. We don't treat things like this as adults. We recognize people are wide ranging in their abilities and skills. If I go and say, I'm going to take piano lessons for the first time ever, and I'm 40 years old, no piano teacher is going to say, oh, you're 40? Okay, perfect. We'll start you on we'll start you on a book for all 40-year-olds. All 40-year-olds start at this level of piano because they should already know this. Like, it's insane, right? But we assume that about all these subjects during school. So the ability to speed up or slow down, I think that's the key, is having that freedom. Hannah Frankman, the Rebel Educator, thanks so much for hopping in and joining us. Keep up the amazing posts and look forward to hearing what you're up to.
Thanks for having me on, Isaac.